Welcome, everyone, to an event co-hosted by the Asia Society Policy Institute and St. Gallen University. The topic of this webinar is digital trade. We recognize there have been lots of webinars over the past 2 years on digital trade, but I think this one's going to be a special one. We have a truly international program with panelists from Europe, Asia, and the United States, and we welcome our international audience as well. In my view, there are two concerning trends on digital trade. The first is on the domestic front in many countries where governments are going into regulatory overdrive in the digital space. And on the international scene, governments are forging different agreements with different partners, leading to concerns about fragmentation of digital trading regimes. We will discuss these concerns, including how worried we should be. But we're also going to explore opportunities to counter these trends. And to do so, we could not have a better panel. Let me just briefly introduce the panelists. First, Vangelis Vitalis, who's the Deputy Trade Secretary from New Zealand, with many years of experience working on trade at the WTO and the OECD, as well as leading negotiations on behalf of the New Zealand government for the recently concluded FTA with the European Union. He's worked on CPTPP, and for today's purposes, DEPA, the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement. Next, we have Ambassador Hung Seng, Singapore's ambassador to the WTO and WIPO, a position he's held for close to 4 years. Importantly for today, he is known as a co-convener, along with his Japanese and Australian counterparts in Geneva, for the WTO e-commerce plurilateral negotiations. He has a distinguished career with Singapore's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, spanning over 30 years of postings. The next panelist is Yeo Han-Koo from Korea, Korea's former trade minister, and he recently joined the Asia Society Policy Institute as a distinguished fellow. He is a veteran trade negotiator leading the Korean teams CPTPP, RCEP, and a series of bilateral FTA negotiations, and also some digital negotiations as well. And last but not least is my partner, Simon Evenett. He is graciously co-hosting our event today. He is a professor at the International Trade at the University of St. Gallen, and importantly, founder and creator of the Global Trade Alert Initiative, tracking trade barriers and regulations imposed by countries all over the world. And I personally became a big fan of his work during the early days of COVID, when he was tracking the export restriction countries were putting on with respect to medicines and medical equipment, as well as materials. He has recently concluded a report on digital trade barriers, the findings he will share with us shortly. Following his brief remarks, we will conduct a moderated discussion among the panelists, and we'll be also entertaining questions from viewers, so please feel free to put them in the chat box. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Wendy, for organizing this event and working with us on it. I'll summarize our latest report, which I co-authored with Johannes Fritz. The first main finding is to reinforce what you said, Wendy, that on the domestic front, we see essentially a huge amount of regulatory developments in the G20 and the EU countries. We sort of characterized it in the report as regulatory overdrive. Perhaps that's because between Q1 of 2020 and Q1 of this year, the amount of regulatory initiatives which are introduced quadrupled. And you see the mushrooming of different initiatives in all the major areas of law which govern the digital economy. Now, I think we would have to be extremely lucky if all of those legal initiatives were perfectly aligned in ways that did not fracture the business models of companies which are seeking global scale. And I suspect that's that is not what is happening. In fact, when we dug deeper into things like data governance regulations, looking across 13 different jurisdictions in some granular detail, You do see big differences across jurisdictions in where they've actually got provisions and the form those provisions take. And so we have to be worried about this. And I think one of the things which we're usefully seeing in the international initiatives which have happened is getting into some level of granularity there to try and encourage alignment. And I think this is a very important, important priority. The second point is that if you go upstream in the digital economy to the extraction of the resources like lithium and rare earths, the production of things like semiconductors, then hardware, software, before you even get to the B2B and B2C services, in that upstream part of the digital economy, there is still a serious traditional trade agenda which needs to be addressed, including tariff reductions, public procurement measures, investment screening measures, and localization requirements. And we were quite surprised to find huge variation across even the G20 in the resort to these different measures. So there's quite a lot of tidying up which needs to be done at that level as well. I think overall, I would say it's important to take a holistic approach here, to go beyond the sort of more philosophical discussions about four internets and get into the details of what governments are doing. What we tried to do in this report was to do exactly that and to highlight where the fragmentation risk is growing.
So perhaps I can start with you, Simon, because you've now detailed all of these barriers and you've kind of promoted transparency in this space. And frankly, it's a pretty sobering picture. Why is transparency important, and what would you hope now governments would do with the report you have produced?
Right. So, I mean, I certainly buy the argument that transparency is important. It's really unfortunate that in the digital area, no international organization has been given the mandate to document what's going on here on a global scale. The OECD, I must say, does yeoman's work. Hats off to them, but no one does this globally. Even the trade policy reviews of the WTO do not cover the digital economy at the moment, and this is a gap as well which needs filling. So there's a problem there. We need to fill this. I think one of the values of going through in great detail what governments are doing is that actually in some areas there's a bit more alignment than people might realize. So of the 28 areas where dimensions of data governance we looked at, in fact, there was some alignment on 6 of them. And I suspect that that's not even known. And that might be low-hanging fruit, could be some low-hanging fruit for measures which governments could take. So I think transparency is very important in sort of clarifying what's going on, demystifying, and in an age of growing suspicion between countries, I think that's really important. And the last big payoff from transparency is it lays out very clearly what the policy options are for governments so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time they construct their own data protection legislation, for example. And I think this would help governments which are a little later in their digital policy development to catch up faster and to hopefully adopt better practices.
One more question for you. You said you looked at the G20 and you know the European countries. Can I assume that everyone's answered dirty in this area, that it's not just certain G20 countries that are imposing all of the restrictions, but everyone has a responsibility?
No, absolutely.
I mean, I think area.
I think there's each of the G20 members and the EU and its member states are taking action. They're at different stages and sometimes they do things differently. But this is not just focusing in on 1 or 2 countries. I think you need to look across all of them. Everyone has a stake in getting this right, and the digital economy is just far too important.
Okay, maybe Vangelis, I can turn to you briefly and talk a little bit about the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which my understanding has been in effect for about 2 years. And I think in this initiative, what New Zealand and your partners, Singapore and Chile, were seeking to do was to add some coherence to this space to promote alignment and cooperation and put forward some rules. Is that a correct assessment? And now 2 years into the agreement, do you think it's having an impact?
Thanks very much, Wendy. Yeah, look, maybe to set a bit of the context of what the 3 of us, as you said, Singapore, New Zealand and Chile, what we were trying to do. I think the first thing is that we kind of acknowledge that the world has changed very dramatically in a sort of a trade policy sense. To use a phrase that we use here in New Zealand, the golden weather for trade policy really has ended. And so the golden weather for us was about rules that were enforceable, about markets that became more open over time rather than less, and that the social license for trade and for trade policy would be sustained. And I think it's fair to say that all three of those things are now assumptions that we can't hold anymore in good faith, because the rules are clearly fragmenting. And I think the challenge we face in the digital sphere is very much tremendous pressure. There are no global rules in effect. I think the second challenge, and this is the really important work that Simon and his team are doing, is shedding a light on the fact that markets are actually not becoming more open in the digital space. This burst of what Simon very politely called regulatory activity, I think many of us look at that with mounting anxiety that this is starting to look like another way to close markets and build protectionism and change the way we think about digital flow. So that was another challenge I think that the three of us were anxious about. And the third challenge was, the social license. And I think the social license around digital trade is something we do need to be thinking very carefully about, because it touches on so many aspects of people's lives: privacy, security, consumer, protections, and so on. So all of these things bound up in this mystique of what exactly does sovereignty mean in a digital, when you're transferring data internationally and so on. So all of those things, I think, came together for the three of us. We met in the margins of another meeting in Geneva, the three of us, and thought to ourselves, we really do need to do something here. And one of the guiding principles for us was, first of all, we are three small economies, and we've got our own tech companies and our own small and medium enterprises that work in this space. And we wanted some rules that reflected more their interests rather than the interests necessarily of the big tech companies, whether they were Chinese or from the United States or from Europe. The three of us felt that the rules, we really did want to shape some rules that would actually work for our financial services firms, our tech companies, our software developers, and to support that industry and engagement. And so out of that, that was kind of one of our guiding principles. The other guiding principle was we wanted something that would work and that over time would attract other economies to join. So kind of what we call here in New Zealand the open plurilateral approach. In other words, you build something with three partners who can move quickly, who share a high level of ambition, who do believe that markets being open and that rules are very important things. And the three of us would quickly bring together an agreement, but then we would open it up and we would look to lobby and encourage other partners to think about joining it. And so that's really where the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement emerged. I think if we're honest, the three of us did not expect to attract attention so quickly. So I think we were really pleased and really pleased and excited when Korea announced its intention to secure Accession, because of course G20, a G20 partner, but also a major tech hub like Korea would be an incredible partner for us in the digital economy space. So look, all of these things I think drove us to think about how we develop these rules. And what we looked to do was quite an interesting approach, a modular approach, because we also thought to ourselves, well, people may not necessarily want to join or be ready to join, but they might use some of the ideas that we've got in there. So you'll see, for example, this goes back to my point about the social license the three of us were concerned about. There's an inclusion module there, which talks about SMEs, about women entrepreneurs. It also talks about Indigenous populations, something that was very important, certainly for us. So all of these aspects that we needed to work through, and that modular approach, I think gave us a new way of thinking about the digital sphere. I think very significantly too, and very deliberately, we called it the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, not the Digital Trade Agreement, because the three of us had a real vision. This wasn't just about trade flows. This was actually about the way in which our economies needed to look as we looked out 5 to 10 years.
Then just following up on something you mentioned, that you wanted to attract other partners. I understand that you're in the final stages of your negotiations to bring Korea into the pact. But we've also noticed that some other players have expressed interest in joining, including China and Canada. Where do those talks stand in the accession process? Have they begun yet?
So with Korea, of course, we are now very much in the closing phase of that accession process. So it's been a very good and engaging and quite a deliberate, structured process that the three of us had with our partners from Korea. Korea, which is an excellent partner in this, and in many ways we couldn't have had a better starting partner out of the G20. You know, an economy that's really serious about the digital sphere, that really wants and sees the opportunity that the digital rules can drive and facilitate economic growth, not just for themselves, but for the region itself. So the Korea process is really well and truly nearly done. And yes, so we recently did announce working parties for both China and Canada within a week of each other. And both processes now will get underway, we hope certainly before the end of the year. One of the challenges of the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, I think, has been that we are three small economies, and so resources are something of a challenge to manage this interest. But it's hard to argue with interest from a major economy like China, a G7 economy like Canada, and of course I already mentioned a G20 economy like Korea. So we're needing to work all that through. We are, the three of us, very clear that the agreement that the three of us negotiated is of high ambition and high quality in terms of the rules. If you look at the three big areas that we've developed, around data, around market access, around interoperability, those three big questions that we all grapple with in the digital sphere have been done to a very high level of ambition within DEPA. And of course, we're committed to ensuring that ambition remains, and that partners that want to join, whether they're in Ottawa or in Beijing or indeed in Seoul, need to meet that standard. So a very strong commitment, and I'm pleased to say we've heard nothing from those accession partners that suggests that they don't share the same vision for the region. Sorry, for the agreement.
Well, good. Maybe we can now turn to Ambassador Tom, because like Vangelis has talked about a regional effort and a really important effort. The question is, what's going on in the WTO? Ideally, if you could multilateral rules in this sector, that would contribute enormously to coherence. Ambassador Tom, can I ask you, as one of the three conveners of this group, where do the negotiations stand, and what are the prospects for a successful conclusion? Because I know there are a lot of skeptics out there which commend the effort, but really question the ability of the successful completion.
Well, thank you very much, Wendy, for that question. But first, let me thank you and Simon for putting together this wonderful event. As to where we are now, I would have loved to say that we have made fantastic progress, but I can't. But I'm happy to say that the JSI on e-commerce has made good and steady progress. We would have liked to move faster, but the pandemic and then Russia's invasion of has really created impediments over the last 2 years. However, we have recently resumed in-person negotiations in July, and that has injected greater dynamism into the negotiations. And we certainly hoped to step on the accelerator and pick up the pace. Second, I think we have made encouraging progress in the facilitative elements of the JSI. To date, we have parked 7 provisions, and these 7 provisions deal with important elements such as paperless trading, e-contracts, e-signatures, spam, consumer protection, open government data, and transparency. These could be regarded as low-hanging fruits as they are relatively less controversial, and many of us will be familiar with them in the e-commerce chapters of FTA. We are also making good progress on some other provisions, such as electronic transactions framework, electronic invoicing, and cybersecurity. The third point that I want to make here is, as you have rightly pointed out, there are several challenging issues, including data flow and data privacy. These are extremely important provisions within the JSI, but as we all know, there are fundamental differences among members. It is also important to note, and I want to emphasize here, that the two issues of data flow and data protection are not mutually exclusive. On the contrary, I think that it is more productive for us to focus on the intersection of data flows and protection and avoid the false dichotomy which often hinder our discussions. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we are inching towards a landing zone. And here I want to add that we count on the support of the industry. Many of our viewers out there, we count on your support to foster stronger dialogue with the government stakeholders on these important issues. Our objective is to secure a substantive provisions to promote cross-border data flows in a safe and secure manner. Let me end by saying that since the JSI negotiations were launched in early 2019, 4 years have passed, and time is not on our side. We have heard and we have taken on board seriously the call from industry stakeholders to ensure that the negotiations do not drag on indefinitely. So I think I will end here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Han-Koo, maybe I can turn to you. I know that when you were trade minister, and this continues now, that Korea was very active, not only in the WTO plurilaterals on e-commerce, but also on DEPA. And I think during your tenure, you concluded a bilateral negotiation with Singapore on digital. Can you, now that you've left the government, can you kind of give us a sense of, from your perspective, why is promoting rules in digital so important? And for you personally, what were like the biggest challenges that you faced in negotiating these deals on behalf of your government?
Thank you, Wendy and Simon, for putting together this wonderful event. Yes, the digital trade is, we experienced during this pandemic is really exponentially exploding in many parts of the world, but especially in Asia, we found that the pace of development is staggering. For example, in Asia, I think it's especially if you look at this ASEAN and also India, they are very young population. Their median age is like early 30s or so. So very tech savvy population. And they're really leapfrogging. When I visited some of the regions, actually many of them, they don't have credit card. They don't have desktop or the laptop in their house, but everything was happening on this mobile based online shopping, and then everything is delivered in quick way. So obviously we saw that there's a great chance the emerging in this digital space, but as policymakers and also as trade negotiators, we don't really catch up with this fast trend happening on the ground. For example, in Korea, we concluded about 18 FTAs, and out of 18 we have the e-commerce related chapters of provision in 12 FTAs, but all of them are so out of date, including Chorus FTA that Wendy, you are a mother of Chorus FTA, and then our latest version of this this digital trade was RCEP, we wanted to go higher in our ambition, but not as high as we wanted. And also from Korea's perspective, we vividly experienced how this ITA, Information Technology Agreement, has really catalyzed the development of this IT industry, not just in industrialized economy, but also in developing world. So we thought that maybe we need some kind of ITA version in this digital trade. And we thought that DEPA or some of the bilateral, especially Korea, Singapore, DPA, could be a kind of very good starting point. If you look at how this TPP really expanded, it started from this P4. And we thought that DEPA could be a kind of digital version of this P4. So I think that's how we approach this digital trade. I think in terms of some of challenges, I think in any negotiation, we face challenges, but in particular, in this digital trade, I think technology is so rapidly emerging, and then there's no really clear answers to all this emerging technology and emerging policy area. So I think we need really sort of creative thinking in our approach, and also in discussing with our domestic constituents. We need to really work closely with these small and medium, as well as these big tech kind of digital companies.
Simon, Han-Koo mentioned the ITA. There was 1 and 2 in the WTO, and both were about getting rid of tariffs in the information technology sector. I think in your report, you still underscore that tariffs remain a serious barrier in the digital space. Is that correct? And do we need an ITA 3?
We definitely found tariff increases. I'm not sure that the tariff barriers themselves are that high, but we've certainly found literally hundreds of tariff increases over time in products, in IT products. And so that actually does make us a bit sympathetic to an ITA 3. But I think, if we are going to come back with something like an ITA 3, we might want to look at some of the non-tariff measures as well, which are also gumming up trade in this area. So yeah, as I said earlier, I really think there's a traditional trade agenda here too, which could be usefully developed once Hung Seng gets the JSI through with his colleagues.
And that gets me to a broader question, and I'm not going to direct it to anyone, and I think Simon touched upon this, that there's no one international organization that's responsible for digital. And I know there have been some think tanks and thought leaders who have suggested maybe we need like a digital economy organization like the World Trade Organization. Can any of you comment on this like lack of one entity, and is that something that you think is needed, or something that governments will think about going forward? Because part of the fragmentation is the different work being done in different organizations, whether it be the G20 or the OECD or the WTO. Who would like to take that question?
Maybe I can give it a shot, Wendy. Ideally, the WTO should and would be the natural platform to address this very important issue. But as we all know, the WTO is a huge, diverse organization with 164 members. And you had earlier in your comment alluded to skeptics. And there are many skeptics within the WTO concerning even the JSI on e-commerce. But let me be brutally frank here. I think we have to distinguish between the genuine skeptics and the cynical skeptics. What do I mean?
I can't wait to hear.
The genuine skeptics will be those who have genuine concerns, particularly from developing members in the JSI. And their concerns deserve to be addressed seriously. For example, concerns surrounding lack of capacity to implement some of the JSI disciplines. And in response to these genuine concerns, the three of us, Australia, Japan, and Singapore, we have jointly established what is called the JSI Capacity Building Framework in June this year, through which we have pooled resources from relevant partners to strengthen digital inclusion. So under the framework, Australia and Switzerland have contributed funding to the Digital Advisory and Technical Assistance Fund, which the World Bank will administer, while Japan and Singapore will contribute through our respective capacity building programs. So for example, in the case of Singapore, through the Singapore Cooperation Program, since 1992, we have conducted numerous courses on a wide range of policy issues such as digitalization, trade and economy, for more than 130,000 government officials from more than 100 developing countries. So these are genuine concerns of developing members concerning lack of understanding, or as Simon had said earlier, we need to demystify digital trade, digital economy. There is apprehension about how they can cope with this rapid pace of digital transformation. And of course, they have concerns about policy space. And then there are the cynical skeptics who have raised unfounded criticisms that are intended to delegitimize the various joint statement initiatives in general, and the JSI on e-commerce in particular. How do we respond to these cynical skeptics? I'm afraid that no matter what we do or say, will change their minds. So that brings me to the set conclusion that even though the World Trade Organization would be the ideal platform to bring about a more coordinated approach, it's going to be challenging. And I suspect that it will be the same, even if we do attempt to do this on a multilateral level at any other organizations. So that would be my take.
Simon, yeah.
So I also think we need to use the existing international organizations a little bit better. So we heard complaints in the last year or so about how the e-commerce moratorium was denuding developing countries of tax revenues. But this is exactly the issue the IMF can go into in some detail. We've heard similar issues on that with preference erosion in the past, and the IMF did great work just showing how that was a non-issue. When it comes to the use of the loss of policy space in the digital domain, I mean, here again, surely the World Bank can commission studies on, well, which countries have used which types of policies to foster their digital economy, and what space do you need and which space do you not need. And it seems to me that through that work, maybe also through the regional development banks, we can build up a body of knowledge which will convince some of the less cynical objectors to these provisions that there are intelligent alternatives beyond discriminating against foreign commercial interests.
Vangelis, maybe I can follow up with you, because you made a point earlier that you didn't call it, you called it the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, not the Digital Trade Partnership Agreement. But I think there's a recognition among New Zealand and its partners that many of the issues that are incorporated in DEPA go beyond trade issues. How do you look at this issue? Does your government, for example, do you bring in experts from different ministries to help you negotiate these deals? Because I assume you're in the trade ministry, you participate, you lead these negotiations that the trade ministry still leads these negotiations. Do you think that structure needs to change, not just in New Zealand, but in other governments, looking ahead?
I mean, I'd make four kind of observations. The first one is, I think we would be, as the ambassador said, I mean, the WTO is still the organization that does develop trade rules. So from our perspective, if you're looking for a multilateral organization where you're going to write the rules, then the WTO is what we have, notwithstanding the challenges that both Simon and the ambassador pointed out. I think, my second observation really is that there is a vital role, I think, domestically in terms of your own unilateral actions that you take in terms of how you develop the digital economy domestically, and how that then gets reflected in the way in which you negotiate agreements. So to answer your question directly, Wendy, yes, of course, and I know our Chilean and Singaporean counterparts through those negotiations, and now in the accession process with Korea, a large number of other government agencies have been involved in this process, and for all of us, because it is about the digital economy. It is not just about digital trade flows. So I think that is really important. I think the other thing that we have been very careful, the three of us, and I know Korea shares this view because that's what we heard very clearly during the accession, is we don't want DEPA to fragment the system. What we want is for it to be a stepping stone that supports and mutually reinforces any multilateral rules that we can develop. So we do see them very much as supporting and being a stepping stone, not a stumbling block. So a building block, not a stumbling block to that multilateral process. My final observation, my fourth observation is, in our experience in chairing APEC last year, capacity building is vital. And that piece that both Simon and the ambassador just mentioned around, how do you support economies and how do you ensure that they are getting the benefits of this? That's one of our really big challenges across not just the APEC region, but kind of internationally as well. That is the way in which you build support then for rules that actually reflect the kind of interests and values of a wide range of, WTO members, for example.
Yeah. Ambassador Tan mentioned two types of skeptics. Maybe I can just introduce another type of skeptic, and many of these are in the United States, that they view these agreements, frankly, as benefiting big tech. And they question whether these types of agreements are really in the interest of the United States. And this, this argument obviously is getting a lot of resonance. And I think has led the United States in the context of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework to emphasize issues like digital inclusiveness, consumer trust, and other worker-related issues. Han-Koo, maybe I'll turn over to you. Korea was an early supporter of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and continues to be a strong supporter. Does Korea share the concerns that some in the United States and probably in Europe and elsewhere in largely, in the developed and developing world, frankly, that these agreements are, or at least are perceived as benefiting big tech? And how, when you were trade minister, how would you counter those claims? I know there are a lot of small and medium-sized enterprises in Korea. Do they benefit from rules in digital trade, and particularly the trade facilitation rules?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Wendy. This is a great question. Let me just address how we view the APEC first, and then I'll delve into this inclusiveness issue. I think APEC could be a very useful platform to address and develop these new harmonizing rules in digital space. Obviously, APEC can build on, for example, CPTPP and DEPA, but from my perspective, APEC need to, in particular, emphasize two elements. I think one is when I discuss the digital trade with this business community, they say it's a really fast growing, but when they try to this business with international partners, they find that lack of this digital infrastructure, right? So I think this cooperation part is very important. For example, when Korean businesses do this digital trade with ASEAN or Indian partners, they complain the lack of infrastructure, such as e-signature, for example, and payment system, etc. And those lack of digital infrastructure become bottlenecks for the faster growth in this digital trade. So I think the IPEC is uniquely positioned to address the lack of digital infrastructure issue by emphasizing on cooperation. For example, many countries in this IPEC, they do a lot of ODA program, but this ODA program among these countries are not coordinated. So if these countries kind of target this digital infrastructure and do more, better coordination in their ODA program, I think that could really be a great boost. And then Wendy, you mentioned this big tech versus SME. I think this digital platform could be a very useful platform for small and medium enterprises or one-person entrepreneur to make their own new business ventures and prosper through this digital space. I met many of these ambitious young entrepreneurs that they made, in normal this space, they are lacking resources to access to this global market. But through this digital platform, they could make their own business if they have just bright ideas and they have really talent. They could full use of this digital space. So yes, there are some concern regarding this big tech, but I think this is a great opportunity for small and medium enterprises. It really depends on how we design and structure this rule to include this the small and medium enterprises entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Vangelis, the DEPA digital inclusiveness space, as well as I think you even have a module, if I'm correct, on small and medium-sized enterprises. Has the experience been, or can the DEPA partners document that, or is there some data that suggests that the small and medium-sized enterprises of the three parties to the agreement have derived benefits, concrete benefits from this agreement?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I mean, as an economist, I'd immediately say with 1.5 years of data available, it's very difficult to draw real conclusions from that. And I think the other issue that we have is that, trade flows between Singapore, Chile, and New Zealand are already very liberal and open already. So it's a little bit like the P4 agreement, which was first negotiated all those years ago, when actually the cost of negotiating the agreement actually outweighed the benefit of the agreement. The point of the agreement actually is that the way in which these rules were developed was in conjunction with, and shaped by three economies who really focused on what would work for small and medium enterprises. How do we reduce the transaction costs of doing business internationally in a digital sense? So to give you some practical examples, in terms of SMEs, the very strong focus that the three of us had was on e-certification and digital certification. How e-signatures, I should say, three of us needing to recognize those, making sure that we had systems in place that we could trust each other on them. And then that was the signature piece. And then there was the e-certification piece. And that, I would argue, has been a major contribution to the way in which the three of us were able to move products between us, including, if I may say so, during COVID. So for us and Singapore, for example, where we had an air freight, a special arrangement between us on air freight, we found that the digital certification process was an absolutely vital one, because prior to the pandemic, we were couriering documents to one another. That clearly made no sense. And so the focus was very much on, practical things that would really reduce the cost for small and medium enterprise. For a big company, paying an extra $300 to courier documents was not a big deal. But for a small company, literally a small company in rural New Zealand shipping, marmalade over to Chile, for example, or to Korea, actually that's a lot of money, especially when you're just sending small packages and so on. So all of these efforts that DEPA generates are very practical. And I mean, if you have a look through the agreement itself, there are some really concrete, practical steps. They aren't in CPTPP, they aren't in USMCA, but they are in DEPA, because what we wanted was something that would actually deliver swiftly, not to the big tech companies for whom these kinds of things were not such a big problem, because they don't confront those kinds of costs and they can absorb the higher transaction costs. Our attempt was really to push down on those transaction costs and tackle them that way.
I mean, can the international community do a better job in explaining and conveying the benefits of digital tools to small and medium-sized enterprise?
I would say yes, and not just as an opportunity to sell abroad, but also to source from abroad as well. We hear so much about how we need to diversify our supply chains and all the rest of this. Well, how are you going to find out about potential suppliers, but if not off the internet? How are they going to be able to demonstrate their credibility and their track records? So I think, yes, we could. I mean, I know the ITC does a great job in putting out materials there, but I have, quite frankly, quite a lot of faith in the private sector. And I think we saw in the pandemic how so many small and medium-sized enterprises rose to the challenge. And I think, to build on what Han-Koo said, there's a strong generational dimension to this. I mean, many of the students that I teach in their 20s, for them, they don't even think in terms of borders when it comes to e-commerce and things like this. So I think that generation will get it, and they will run with the type of tools that Vangelis has talked about.
Ambassador Tan, maybe we can talk a little bit more about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. I mean, Singapore is also an enthusiastic supporter of this US-led initiative. There is a digital element to these negotiations. How does it like fit in? Because here Singapore's doing bilateral agreements with the individual countries. It's a member of DEPA. It's a member of IPEF. You're co-leading the WTO talks. I think it's safe to say that digital is a very important issue for Singapore. But are you worried about fragmentation, or somehow are you looking at Singapore can play an important role in kind of bringing this all together for everyone?
Thank you very much for that question, Wendy. I think the fact that, Singapore and New Zealand as small countries are involved in all these different initiatives underline the fact that being small, we are very much price takers. But what we really hope to do, say with DEPA, as Vangelis has pointed out, is really to act as catalyst to hopefully demonstrate in very concrete and tangible manner that, hey, the digital economy, including e-commerce, is not just for big tech companies. In fact, the main beneficiaries, as many studies have shown of e-commerce, are MSMEs and women entrepreneurs. And many of these examples can be found in developing countries, including in Africa. So one of the things that we really have to do is, as you have asked, how can we socialize this fact to a wider audience? And here, I think, besides the industry, we have to create more opportunities and platforms to bring together MSMEs, women entrepreneurs from developing countries, for them to demonstrate to the world that we do not have to fear the digital economy. In fact, we have to embrace it. So from Singapore's perspective, our participation in all these initiatives, besides the bilateral agreements that we have signed with Korea, for example, we take a multi-pronged approach from bilateral to plurilateral like DEPA, and also multilateral, which is what is happening at the JSI on e-commerce. We don't see them as mutually exclusive. We see them, as Vangelis had said, as building blocks. And the important point that I want to emphasize here is that the JSI on e-commerce, for example, is a transparent, inclusive process. And despite what the cynical skeptics have alleged, it is not a closed club. In fact, it's open for everybody. And the fact that 87 members representing more than 90% of global e-commerce are participants clearly underline the fact that the JSI on e-commerce is an open plurilateral, and our objective really is to embed it within the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you. We're getting towards the end of the program. I did want to raise APEC. Next year, the US will be hosting APEC. And last year, New Zealand hosted APEC. I know that during the New Zealand year, there was some hope that progress could be made in the digital front. But frankly, this is a views between the United States and China in the space, my understanding, has prevented progress. If looking the US year and given China's interest joining DEPA, do you think there is an opening for APEC to once again kind of get more active in digital space and promote some digital initiatives?
That's to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, let me kind of make two observations about this, because I think the first is the role of APEC here. So APEC isn't going to write rules. That's not the purpose of APEC. The purpose of APEC is first to build confidence, and second, my second observation is to build norms. And I think on those two things that there is a real urgency to this in the digital space. If you look at the work that Simon has done, the numbers are striking. 2020, 71 interventions, 217 interventions in 2022. Increasing trend of protectionism, increasing trend against interoperability, increasing trend, challenging the way in which we think about data transfer and the range of safeguards that countries regard as legitimate or not. There's a lot in this space, and I think APEC has a really important contribution to make. The Aotearoa Plan of Action, which is of course the work plan for APEC for the next 20 years, that it was our privilege to kind of chair and shepherd through last, now over a year ago, that has a very strong digital piece, and that is the digital part of that program of work is very much about building confidence amongst us, and then what kind of norms can we create? What kind of guidelines? What kind of shared principles might we have? And I was, if you look at the material again that Simon identified, there's 6 areas of data governance where you can see there are some shared views around that. It does strike me that if you have that kind of transparency, again, the importance of this work on the transparency of what's going on out there, that then shapes the way in which we think about, okay, so where are there overlaps? Where do we actually have a shared view in the digital space? Let's start with that. I think you talked about them as low-hanging fruit, Simon. I don't want to underestimate the challenge. It will be significant, but nevertheless, you do have to start somewhere, and you do have to believe that APEC, with its long tradition of being a bit of an incubator for interesting ideas, becomes the place in which you, build confidence amongst us, and then you start thinking about, okay, what kind of norms can we have? And look, the history of APEC tells us that once you develop those norms find their way into the so-called hard rules that we use in the agreement. The origins of a lot of what we did in CPTPP, what we did in the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand FTA, its roots are clearly in the work that APEC did 5-10 years before. It is about building confidence amongst ourselves. And I do think one of the big challenges that the US is going to have next year is going to be, how does it manage its APEC agenda alongside the IPEF parallel track that's running along? And I say that in very, very aware that, of course, New Zealand is chairing CPTPP next year. So, I'll be chairing the senior officials post, and I'm very focused on how these three tracks are going to engage one another and how they support one another, particularly in the digital economy sphere.
Yeah, maybe we can just close and then I can turn to the other panelists. Like, when you look at all this again, I think we've covered a lot of territory. How do you look at all these different streams of international work and the growing, regulatory restrictions on behalf of domestic governments? Do you think a year from now, things are going to be better in this space, both in terms of countries working together on norms, on cooperation mechanisms, but also on rules? And do you think that maybe we will turn the tide and Simon could report fewer restrictions? We could see a downward trend in restrictions. Simon, I'll turn to you first.
Well, I hope so, but I think a prerequisite for this is essentially putting the facts on the table and working through them. And in that sense, taking a lot of the drama out of these discussions and getting down and dirty with the details. And maybe if that's what these three different tracks produce next year, then we can start laying the foundations for a lot more cooperative approaches to these matters. But I do think now that the data is coming through and there's more information coming through on RTA provisions as well, on their implementation, that together this is building a fact base which could support much more informed deliberation. So I hope the officials run with it.
Yeah, I think an important wake-up call. Han-Koo, over to you.
Yes, I think that we have to seize the moment. I think technology was there from a long time ago, but it took so long to change people's behavior. And I think the pandemic provided opportune timing. So now I think it's really time for international community to step up our efforts to do something on this digital trade. In that sense, I think the three, the initiative, and in particular, I think IPEF has a great chance to address all those issues. So I'm looking forward to this IPEF moving forward, with the positive and win-win agenda next year or so.
And Ambassador Tan, I'll give you the last word. It's a cause for optimism.
Well, I'm sorry I have to disappoint you, because while I think it is desirable, absolutely, to have greater coordination, coherence at an international level, at a multilateral level, on rules regarding e-commerce, digital economy, so that hopefully we will see less restrictions. Unfortunately, I don't see that happening. And the main reason, and I want to go back to the point that Vangelis raised about trust. I think we need a higher level of strategic trust globally, particularly among the key players. And I'm not sure if we will be able to see that within the time frame that you have set, which is end of the year. But having said that, if we don't get our act together, every one of us, then I think the industry may take it into their own hands at a certain level. And at another level, the rapid pace of digital transformation may render all the things that we are trying to do today irrelevant in a few years' time. Thank you.
Okay, well, with that, I'm going to conclude this webinar. We did have some strands of optimism, but I think we all agree that Simon's work has provided an important wake-up call to the international community. There's lots of discussions on digital going on bilaterally, plurilaterally, multilaterally. It's important that all those talks there's close coordination and cooperation. But I don't think any of us can underestimate the challenges as we look ahead. So with that, thanks to everyone for joining us, the Asia Society Policy Institute, and on behalf of St. Gallen University, we really appreciate our viewers joining us, and particularly for those on the panel that are either joining us late at night or early in the morning. We hope you get some sleep now. Thank you.